part of the road between them and the curb they're headed for. When I do get an ego reaction because I crossed in front of a turf-concerned guy, I internally do my loving-kindness practice. May you grow in cooperativeness and find Buddha's way. Taking what happens as information and an opportunity for practice, rather than as aggression toward me, what can arouse my ego, helps me maintain equanimity. I attempt to do this in all my encounters with ego-driven people. We certainly gain equanimity when what happens simply informs us about the actions of others, rather than arouses an ego reaction in us. Loving-kindness practice can give us an alternative sense of ourselves and of where we stand in the world of others. This may seem like a daunting challenge, but we can recall that a practice means that we don't need affectionate feelings to begin with. We simply practice, and then the loving-kindness, the goodwill, already and always inside us, blooms. The ego thrives on ranking. Ranking is related to echelons, classes, status, standing, station, apartheid, castes, elitism, or prestige and privilege based on power and birth. The emphasis is on who is up and who is down, who's above and who's below, who deserves more, who less, who is greater than or less than. We see this ego sorting process everywhere. We rank people according to education, finances, fame, age, and looks. We rank cars and other products according to price. Then, we see the owners as having or not having status accordingly. We rank houses according to location and size. We rank foods according to how fancy they are. For instance, pheasant under glass seems a more appropriate meal for people of higher status than does roasted chicken. We rank people on the basis of their clothes. Designer outfits give more status than ordinary serviceable clothing. We even rank flowers. A daisy is not as valuable as an orchid. A carnation is not as classy as a gardenia. There are indeed levels of appeal in all people and things. But the egotist believes herself above others because she has what the world ranks more highly. The life of a healthy person is based on integrity and loving kindness rather than status. Ranking is a form of categorizing that allows some people to feel themselves above others, which is the very opposite of what love, the great equalizer, is about. Can ego ever bow to that possibility of possibilities? Spiritually awakened people have seen through the sham of ego-separateness and sorting, and they choose what leads to and affirms equality and connectedness. They accept that diversity is not wrong, and that community is what we all are in our true nature, who we are beyond the ego, the more than what we think we are. The word face, as used in lose face or save face, would also not be heard or have to be honored if the big ego were not in the picture. To lose face refers to being humiliated, ridiculed, minimized, discredited, or demeaned in the presence of others. We recall here the book of 5,000 dreams recorded by ancient Egyptians. The most common theme, barring none, was not sex. It was the shameful disgrace and the horror of losing face. Saving face, with its pattern of affront retaliation, has been ritualized in human behavior. Examples from the past and present are defending one's honor, dueling, blood feuds, gang rules, war. In each of these forms of face-saving, the affronted ego gives itself permission to strike back harshly. In duels and war, society permits the event. In feuds and gang behaviors, society frowns on it. The healthy alternative to saving face is to learn to be a good loser when necessary. In the arrogant ego mindset, we have to save face, and we can't abide losing face under any circumstances. A healthy ego does not need to save face and doesn't lose face. A healthy ego, when shown to be wrong, can take that as useful information without having to be embarrassed or shamed. We don't have to save face since we're not trying to look good at all costs. We may find public correction unappealing, but we do not fume or sulk when it happens. When our misbehavior or misperceptions are corrected, we're happy to be brought more in line with the appropriate view of things. We're glad that we can now act more wisely and lovingly. We are grateful for the correction. It has helped us toward our enduring purpose in life, to show all our love to everyone and be wise in all our choices. If others think we've lost face, then that is their issue, their ego that is projecting the importance of lose face or save face concerns. A friend once told me that his 2 engineers were fighting about how to do a job for him. They couldn't come to an agreement, so they came to my friend for mediation, saying, "We came to you because we know you only care about what makes sense for the project, not about who wins our bantam rooster contest and gets to be the one to save face." My favorite Zen story speaks to the issue of ego and saving face very profoundly. A proud but uncouth samurai confronted a famous and wise Zen teacher. The samurai was dressed in full armor and demanded, in an imperious voice, "Teach me about heaven, hell, and enlightenment." The master took one look at him and said, "You don't have what it takes to learn that." The ego-affronted, face-losing samurai drew his sword to kill the teacher as his way of retaliating and thereby saving face. At this, the master pointed to the drawn sword and said, "That's hell." The samurai was deeply moved by this response and humbly replaced his sword into its scabbard. The master pointed to that action and quietly commented, "That's heaven." The samurai then bowed to the master and begged to become his student. The master said, "And that's enlightenment." In this story, hell symbolizes the ego trying to save face by violence and retaliation. Heaven is found in giving up vengeful impulses in favor of the arts of peace. We are ready for enlightenment when we're no longer trying to uphold our ego posture. Our only goal is finding the truth no matter how it happens. Only then does our stubborn, immobile ego stance release its grip so that a lifetime can be called a journey. The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are. Hell is being stuck in ego. Joseph Campbell. Where did ego come from? Ego begins to develop in early childhood during the terrible twos. The first garish flowering of ego appears in about the ninth grade. It looks cute at age 2, and even in ninth grade. We may be amused by the growing ego mindset in our children until they're around age 15, when it can become obnoxious. We're frustrated as we try to curb their inflated ego reactions in favor of cooperation with house rules. This can go on until they leave home to strike out on their own. It helps to realize that their developmental goal, starting at around age 15, is to separate and become their own persons. This is why their ego becomes most difficult for parents to deal with in the interval from when the child is a sophomore in high school until he or she goes off to college or to a job. Once they can separate, they don't have to be so oppositional, and the ego may be less of a problem. In any case, as they grow through the teens, we can only offer compassionate solicitude while setting the sturdy limits they certainly need. They challenge us because they're often not respecting the limits but testing them, which is simply a symptom of the need to separate. Hopefully, they'll eventually be able to build a healthy ego without the swagger. A child's ego grows in healthy ways when she's supported in achieving her developmental goals. This will be difficult when a household is volatile or has few clear limits. Children and adolescents then lack wise direction and act out their own impulses without intelligent judgment, often driven by angry rebellion. With this come prejudiced assumptions, self-negating beliefs, vindictive reactions. The ego learns to be aggressive when a household does not provide safety and security. At the same time, a household can impose many expectations while not providing the holding environment that supports growth. When a household exhibits shaming or demeaning qualities, put-downs, sarcasm, a child feels attacked and wants to be on the attack toward others. The fear of being shamed becomes stronger when someone has had shame ingrained in her in early life. Boys are especially well trained into engorging their ego. In reaction to a harsh father, we males might rebel to reduce our need for connection by rejecting the very one we need. We might, alternatively, imitate him to reduce our stress by identification. Either way, we hurt ourselves, and we sometimes even construct a renegade ego that ransacks loving connections. A society or family wounds boys when it teaches them that to be men means being aggressive. We are to be tough, retaliatory, intolerant, stoical, emotionless except for anger, dominating, heterosexual, promiscuous, abusers or users of women, and so forth. Then, fear of being shamed by peers becomes more important than relationship and integrity. Many of us were carefully trained to believe that we're supposed to dominate women and look down on gay people. We were taught not to be like either group. We were to be racist, violent, hard on others, always high performers sexually, making continual conquests of many women, drinking heartily. Regarding this last mention, I recall what someone once said to me: alcohol is to ego what spinach is to Popeye. With healthy ego development, we would have been taught to take our place in society as equals and to stand up for everyone's right to equality. We would have been taught to respect women and men, no matter what their sexual orientation. This is how we see the direct connection between a vigorous ego, our personal goal, and a society of justice, peace, and love, our collective goal. Each goal is a purpose. Each purpose is a calling. And it's never too late for us to answer yes to the great calling, and egolessness that leads to enlightenment. The ego learns to be fear-based when, during abusive episodes in early life, we're not allowed to defend ourselves. An abusive mother might, for instance, make fun of a child if he raised his hand to protect his head when she was beating him. With parents who were critical, invasive, unstable, neglectful, violent, out of control, a child is gravely unsafe and insecure. Then, beliefs about herself are instilled by her parents' ego, not by their hearts. This becomes an undertow of anxiety, and she has to be on the lookout for danger from every quarter. Again, the lack of safety and security, the necessary ingredients for the development of self-esteem. Our ego learns to be arrogant as soon as our parents or others teach or model to us that we are better than others or above them. A spoiled or overvalued child has difficulty creating his own boundaries. He may then run roughshod over others' liberty. It's also common for the inflated ego to deny the power or even the reality of the spiritual realm. It cannot brook the possibility of a higher reality than itself. We see an example of this defensiveness of ego toward spiritual powers in the study of Caesar's reaction to his wife Calpurnia's dream. On the Ides of March, she reported her last night's dream that warned him not to go to the Senate that day. Likewise, a soothsayer, symbol of the wisdom self, also warned him of the mortal peril he was in. But Caesar's alpha ego could not permit compliance with their non-logical, face-losing recommendations. The almighty Caesar ego was at high pitch, so spiritual powers were ignored. A Freudian view of ego. A healthy center. In the Freudian view, ego is the strong, conscious center of the psyche, the sense of oneself as an agent, the one who accomplishes things. The ego mediates between primitive instinctive impulses, which Freud referred to as the id, and the corrective socializing side of us called the superego. The lifelong responsibility of the socially adept ego is to temper our unruly instincts with the aid of the socially conscientious superego. This is how we make appropriate choices that ensure our personal survival and that make us successful in relating to others. Our strong ego knows how to make choices on the basis of long-term values rather than on the immediate gratifications that might jeopardize our future. Such a strong ego learns to manage changes and deal with them in ways that ensure the success of our life purposes and goals. Our social self makes its choices for itself, while keeping the needs of others in mind. It uses the style of assertiveness with cooperativeness. Modern brain research suggests that this healthy ego executive function is mediated by the most recent and evolved part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. A Jungian view. Spiritual riches. The ego, from the Jungian perspective, is the center of conscious life, although an inflated ego might believe itself to be the center of the entire psyche. That role, however, belongs to the self, to which the ego is subordinate and from which it evolved. The self, capitalized to represent its transcendent quality, includes both the conscious and unconscious dimensions of our psyche. The self is a depository and fount of communal human wisdom garnered over the ages. It's the same in all of us, but it displays itself uniquely in each of us. The ego thrives on dividing and analyzing experience. The self combines apparent opposites and synthesizes experience. The ego focuses on uniqueness. The self is about wholeness without division. Experiences of the self communicate a numinous and revelatory feeling, which Carl Jung compared to the divine. He called the self the God archetype that both lives within us and transcends us. The ego is meant to serve the purposes of the self, to enter an ego-self axis, a working together. This is what Jung called individuation, a lifelong process, never completed, in which the wholeness of the self shines through in our healthy ego choices or in spiritual epiphanies. The self might also be thought of as our true nature, because it cannot fall prey to the falsehoods of separateness or egotism. A depth view, the more than meets the eye. Over the centuries, people have glimpsed a larger life in us than can be accounted for by our ego, body, or personality. This higher, larger, deeper, all admittedly inadequate spatial metaphors, level of our existence is, of course, a mystery. Jung posits a self. We hear Buddhists refer to Buddha nature, an enlightened reality in us, our true nature. Christians speak of Christ consciousness or an indwelling spirit. In 12-step programs, we hear of a higher power. Sometimes what is beyond ego is simply called spirit, soul, divine life, God within us. All these configurations are similar, though certainly not meant in exactly the same way. In any case, something, we know not what, seems to be holding our tenuous life of ego desires and fears. This something feels to some people like a presence, reliable, accompanying, comforting, challenging. It is not an it, nor is it an I. We might say that there seem to be larger dimensions to our identity, farther reaches of what we are, too far to be known fully, too close to be denied entirely. Walt Whitman, in his poem Song of the Open Road, states it this way: I am larger, better than I thought. Going to the depth of ourselves goes deeper than any of our history or attitudes. We find out that we are spacious beyond ego limitations, with room in our hearts for all beings. When ego is at the service of this larger life, we co-create a world of justice, peace, and love. But often ego inflates itself, becomes egotistical, possessed only by its drive toward its own survival or aggrandizement. This inflation displays itself on a spectrum from ordinary appropriate self-preservation to me first without taking others into account. We can harness the energies in an inflated ego so that they become useful for our growth. The ego can also become more realistic about its place in the world of others. It can become cooperative without necessarily becoming competitive. Then we do all it takes for us to survive, but learn to act in accord with a caring connection to others, too. We move from selfishness to a sense of connectedness. Thus, though self can't be explained, it can be realized, thanks to our commitment to caring connection. This happens mostly in the moments in life when our ego is off duty. Then all that's left of us is all that is really lasting, an ever-unfolding, interwoven self. Each of us is a single instance of that infinite connectedness. Every relationship, circumstance, and predicament offers an opportunity for that instance to occur. Buddhism helps us make this transition when it teaches that since there's no separate self-existence, we are all responsible for more than our own needs. This attitude is the origin of compassion. There are no separate selves, but all of us are individuals as connection. Thus, we might say, humorously but accurately, that the whole world is both a bureau of missing persons and a tight-knit family, all accounted for. Perhaps this sums it up well. I am a human, that is, finite, being, that is, infinite. A Buddhist view, flux and flow. In Buddhism, the word ego refers to the illusion of separateness. Thus, as we just heard, there is no separate self, since the reality is that we are entirely contingent upon and connected to everything and everyone. We change continually in accord with changing causes and conditions. Thus, our task is to work with our connection to the world to shape it for enlightenment rather than for egotistical purposes. In the language of the Dharma, Buddhist teaching, we are enlightened, free of illusion, when we are no longer me-centered because there's no just me to center into. Instead, our identity is part of a whole. Our I exists only as contingent upon the unique conditions of it in our lives. There is no inner headquarters from which some generic I gives orders. I am I in the web of life. I have a unique personality and gifts because they form a needed part of the web of life. Modern psychology agrees with the Buddhist teaching that we are continually changing in accord with the world around us. We're not like mannequins that can be dressed in a variety of ways, but when undressed, go back to being as they were. There is no neutral, unrelated, disconnected, set point, pure, bare, blank, generic, baseline, reference point self to keep coming back to. There is only self with this person, self in this circumstance, self feeling this. What we call a fixed self is flux and flow, change and continuity, not one or the other, but both. We are many selves. Right now I am David typing this page, David wondering if I'm explaining myself well, and David planning to go on a bike ride later. There is no moment at which I am just plain David. There's no generic, original, go back to David only. Thus, there is no self in me, only a sense of self because of a non-stop series of thoughts, interactions, and feelings. If I were to try to locate a substrate self, I would be going on a wild goose chase. I would get the message I sometimes see on the internet, site not found. Thus we might say that we have a relative self, not an absolute self. It is relative to all that happens, and it does not stand on its own. We can, however, rightly declare a conventional identity in ourselves, but that's only the stage on which our theater group of selves acts out our own story. We are like kaleidoscopes. The beads remain the same in number, like our body-minds enduring over our lifetime. But the display, who we are in the moment, keeps changing with each turn. As in a kaleidoscope, there's no original single layout to go back to, no reset button, just an infinite variety of possibilities in accord with how things turn out. Introducing the practices. Before beginning our practices in this audiobook, we can remind ourselves that it takes a healthy working ego to commit to a practice. Every practice takes discipline. A practice requires putting off immediate gratification for higher goals. we are called upon to take initiative, to follow through. Likewise, it takes some spiritual realization to engage in practices appropriately. They're not coercive, forced on us. They're not accomplishments that fluff our sense of an ego triumph. We come to see the role of grace, the gift dimension of life, in our work on ourselves. Grace is the special help that comes to us from a power beyond ego. It's a gift, so it can't be earned, nor is it the result of effort. Something happens within us that turns us toward enlightenment, or gives us more courage, or helps us walk our path more consciously, more wisely, more compassionately. This fits with our realization that letting go of egotism is a grace rather than an accomplishment. Without a consciousness of the grace dimension in spiritual growth, our practices can become yet more subtle ways the ego avoids its need for assistance. I can do this all on my own. Then, ego is an acronym for edging grace out. My audiobook, The Power of Grace, Recognizing Unexpected Gifts on Our Path, published by Audible in 2015, may be of help on this topic. Here's an example of the path to grace. We see the value in a certain conviction or commitment. For instance, we suddenly get it that nonviolence is the on-ramp to social justice. That aha is a moment of grace. Then we notice examples, people who have chosen this path, such as Martin Luther King, Jr., Archbishop Oscar Romero, or Nelson Mandela. We are inspired by them. So far, we have passed through 3 grace-induced stages: recognition of a value, admiration of models, and inspiration to do likewise. However, we may feel afraid to risk ourselves the way our models did. It may be hard to find courage in ourselves. We feel powerless. We may find that this is precisely the moment at which a new grace comes in. We suddenly find courage in ourselves where there was fear before. Grace is how we moved from powerlessness to empowerment. This is the same pathway we see, for example, in 12-step programs. We admit that we are powerless over our use of alcohol, and the higher power of grace appears to help us recover. Finally, we recall this friendly warning from Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche in Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. Ego is able to convert everything to its own use, even spirituality. It's important to see that the main point of any spiritual practice is to step out of the bureaucracy of ego. Our practices are not making us bigger or better than others. They're only downsizing our ego so it can fit into our hearts. When we've done that, we'll be able to love ourselves and others, which is the purpose and fruition of all spiritual practices. Practice. Cultivating big mind. In Zen Buddhism and in other traditions, our true nature beyond ego is called big mind. When we act from a big ego, we are in small mind. The big mind makes no defense, unlike the ego so beleaguered by its past, its disappointments, its regrets. St. Augustine may have been referring to ego and big mind when he wrote, "My mind is too narrow to contain itself." Big mind is our pristine identity, invulnerable to our history, experiences, or deeds. Big mind is an ever-expanding open space in which we are secure about our wholeness. We feel this as one energy, both within us and containing us, both around us and holding all that is. The room, closet, in which ego operates is narrow, constricted because it has to have everything be just so. Big mind is infinitely capacious. Our big mind, like our higher self, our essence beyond ego, is more like a presence than an identity, a wholeness of which each of us is a part, while all the wholeness is in all of us too. When we become aware of big mind and honor it as our true nature, many changes occur in us. There's less interfering ego energy in our relationships with others. We still have fear within us, but not as our leader. Fear threatens us, but cannot hold us hostage. We are more forthcoming. We're no longer thrown for a loop by feedback or criticism. We are simply present with equanimity in all the vicissitudes of life and relationship. We still have preferences, but when they're not honored, that no longer makes the difference between happiness and despair. We are free to be ourselves, with all our inadequacies in view, because expressing who we are has become more important to us than accommodating the image we thought others were supposed to have of us. In all this, we see how a spiritual realization we can rely on Buddha mind in us helps us grow psychologically. Practice. Mindfulness and big mind. Our true nature, Buddha nature, higher self, all there is of us beyond ego, can sometimes emerge into full consciousness. Mindfulness is a practice to let that breakthrough happen more and more. When things fall into disarray, when we feel out of control, when our ego can't help us reconstitute ourselves, mindfulness can help us. In mindfulness, we neither express nor repress the thoughts and feelings that swirl through us, but simply sit in and with them. We are bearing witness without forcing ourselves to defend, prosecute, or judge. This is holding our experience, making space for it, so we can reassemble our executive powers. Experiencing pure emotions, without the usual embroideries, makes them sources of information about ourselves and the moment we find ourselves in, an entry into our true nature. Likewise, ego reactions are our actual experience, so they're exactly what we work with on our path to enlightenment. We get to experience what is before ego meddles with reality. We see ourselves with unobstructed frankness and clarity, but without judgment. For instance, we might judge ourselves as selfish. Instead, we can say, I found another way to know myself, feel compassion for myself, and, of course, work on myself. To see as a witness rather than a judge is a powerful way to demote our egotism. Mindfulness is non-dual. We thus learn not to polarize, but to look for common ground. We want what is best for all concerned, rather than reaching ego's goal of personal interest over the common good. This is true moral awareness. All this happens with a generous smile, not a clenched jaw or ego's grimace. The emphasis nowadays on mindfulness meditation is encouraging because the practice is meant to diffuse ego's hegemony over us. We learn to notice how our ego makes constant comments and critiques of reality. We see a path to letting that style go. We notice that the move toward healthy ego living always involves a reconciliation with reality and a fervent fidelity to it. Freudian, Jungian, Depth, Buddhist, and spiritual understandings of ego have helped us see this. Each of them shows us ways to let go of the ego mindset that interferes with our chances at integrity and love. Chapter 2. What is my ego so afraid of? There may be a sense of being lost or exposed, a sense of vulnerability. That is simply a sign that ego is losing its grip on its territory. It's not a fundamental threat. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, the heart of the Buddha. So far in our description of egotism, we've often come upon the words have to in describing ego reactions and habits. The ego is not free when it feels forced. I have to be first, above others, the center of attention, and I might not pay attention when someone's talking about himself or herself. So I can never or seldom accept the position appropriate to me, be willing to share the limelight with others, and attune to them empathically. I have to maintain my pride, so I can seldom or never show some humility. I have to save face, especially in front of friends or workmates, so I can seldom or never admit when I'm wrong, feel remorse, apologize, and make amends. I have to be praised and admired and have my good deeds noticed, look good at any cost, so I can seldom or never receive appreciation but not crave or demand it, do good deeds without drawing attention to them. I have to be acknowledged as competent in all areas, so I can seldom or never admit my limitations and be open to going beyond them. I have to show off, pat myself on the back, ways of overcompensating for my self-doubt and low self-esteem, so I can seldom or never ask for appreciation directly and build my self-esteem on the basis of what I am, not what I do. I have to keep reminding people of my entitlement and my status, so I can seldom or never be with other humans as an equal. I have to exploit, take advantage of others or cheat them without remorse based on my sense of entitlement, so I can seldom or never be fair and generous, make amends for taking advantage of anyone. I have to be overly independent, so I can seldom or never show that I need others or be able to receive from them. I have to compete, sometimes in a cutthroat way or with an excessively self-promoting style, so I can seldom or never cooperate in a way that's respectful of what others can offer, take a team approach. I have to win, even in board games, so I can seldom or never lose gracefully, be bested when appropriate. I have to envy and resent anyone who gets a better position or deal than I do, so I can seldom or never rejoice in another's success and congratulate him for it. I have to get an absolutely fair share when something is divided or passed around, even my piece of pie, so I can seldom or never pay little attention to who gets what and appreciate whatever I receive. I have to operate on the basis of quid pro quo. If I give to you, I expect you to give back in equal or greater measure, so I can seldom or never be truly generous. I have to establish my turf, even if it's not exactly mine, so I can seldom or never share space and make room for others' needs. I have to be in full control of people, being seized by the archetype of domination, so I can seldom or never honor others' freedom and be flexible about who has control, relating to the archetype of liberty and community. I have to get my way, so I can seldom or never be flexible. I have to stand out in a group as the one who's making a significant contribution to the project, so that I can be seen as important and be given full credit. So I can seldom or never simply be part of the group, with appreciation for what others contribute while I present my ideas as well, not to look important, but to share my gifts generously. I have to act as if I were invulnerable, so I can seldom or never be open to the impact of others' behavior on me, be available for an intimate relationship. I have to be treated with kid gloves at all times, even if people have to walk on eggshells when they're around me. So I can seldom or never create an atmosphere of safety and security, the foundations of trust. I have to keep looking prosperous, a high roller, a big shot, even when I no longer am, and I won't downsize my lifestyle to fit my new circumstances if necessary. So I can seldom or never make decisions that are appropriate to my personal and financial status, no matter how discomforting. I have to refuse what is or looks like a handout, no matter how much I may need it. So I can seldom or never accept help with gratitude. I have to blame or project responsibility for my own mistakes onto others. So I can seldom or never take responsibility for my actions and be willing to appear fallible like all humans. I have to get away with misdeeds or selfish motives rather than be found out and confronted. So I can seldom or never form a conscience that is caring toward others and fair to all. I have to look down on people I consider less than myself, sometimes ridiculing, belittling, or snubbing them. So I can seldom or never show compassionate respect and be inclusive. I have to make a critical comment about the behavior of others, including strangers, usually pointing out to them the right way to do things, even when it does not affect me personally. So I can seldom or never respect boundaries, make allowances for others, maintain respectful silence, mind my own business. I have to hold a grudge or break off all communication when angry. So I can seldom or never look for ways to work things out and to let go of resentment. I have to retaliate or be spiteful, so I can seldom or never reconcile and forgive. I have to create drama when what happens doesn't suit me, so I can seldom or never take what happens as information and roll with the punches. These have-to behaviors are defensive and aggressive, make life hard on everyone, and are lethal to intimacy. These behaviors that the egotist can seldom or never exhibit show flexibility. Here the ego is tamed and enters the service of the higher self, so that the greater good can be served and relationships can thrive. Regarding the previous and all similar comparisons in this audiobook, they show the extremes. Between each is a wide spectrum of alternative behaviors and styles. Each of the compulsions listed is based on a fear of appropriate humility, of being like everyone else, a human among humans, facing the conditions of human existence with no exemptions. The fear-based ego cannot handle the givens of life, such as these. We win some, we lose some. We all look bad sometimes. We all lose face. We are all sometimes wrong. We are not always first or on top. We are not always in control, in fact, hardly ever. We are not entitled to special treatment or to immunity from any of life's givens. None of these have to scare us, only help us accept our humanness. Each given offers us the opportunity to feel more at home in the human family, to accept ourselves just as we are, to feel compassion for ourselves and for others too. In other words, accepting our limits and letting them be seen and corrected by others gives us the courage it takes to let go of fear, the same as letting go of ego. Yes, I sometimes lose, look bad, lose face, am wrong. I'm not first, on top, or in control. I am open to those possibilities since being flexible is more important to me than being perfect. Most of the fears in an inflated ego are not grounded in reality. We become trapped in a pattern of defenses when there's no real threat. We are often still reacting to painful and fear-striking events from our past, as if they were happening in the present. The part of our brain that stores the memory of peril is activated by new threats that are not as dangerous as they were in childhood, but feel so. Our primitive, self-protective reactions are geared to a time when we lacked inner resources. We didn't have access to all the resources we now have to take care of ourselves. Our fear reactions cancel our present in favor of our past. We then lose track of the wonderful new options that may come our way. We will happily recognize new vistas that await us in the here and now once ego is not obscuring the view. Now we can see why freedom from fear is directly connected to letting go of egotism. The fears that fuel and inflame ego flourish because of our continuing lawsuit with the givens of our existence. When we look deeply into our fears, we always wind up at a given to which we have not surrendered. The word surrender is indeed a scary option to the fear-besieged ego. That defensive ego takes over to protect us from any vulnerability. It could be that our vulnerability in childhood was taken to mean weakness. The resultant sense of shame has made us mistrust ever after the very vulnerability that can make us lovable. Is this what we're so afraid of? An egotist finds it difficult to admit being afraid. Road rage, mentioned previously, is the best example. When someone cuts us off in traffic, we feel fear because our safety has been endangered. But we instantly turn our fear into rage. Instead of breathing a sigh of relief that we're unharmed, we become angry and want to retaliate. We believe it is our right to punish those who have dared to cross us, literally. In fear-induced anger, we might say some venomous things. We might honk, swear, use insulting gestures, tailgate. Each of these options says, "How dare you scare me?" Ego has the "how dare you" in it because it believes itself entitled to be treated with honor and respect at all times by all people. What we are really saying is, "How dare you not love me?" This, too, contradicts a given of life with others that ego can't accept. Not everyone will love us, let alone respect us on the road. Anger is the response of fight, whereas fear is the response of flee or freeze. Males particularly are taught to turn their fear into anger. Admitting fear doesn't mesh with the male image, which is actually the male ego image. To maintain ego, we instead have to look powerful in the midst of any predicament. We thereby limit our vision of strength, so it can't include the full range of emotion, for example, fear or grief. feelings that incite compassion in others, resulting in more connection. Oh, how many little ways the ego has of avoiding love and showing ourselves as lovable. We keep seeing how ego fear is fear of love because it's a fear of being vulnerable. The given of sometimes not being in control with which we're all sometimes assailed. This is another way the aroused ego sadly cancels its chances for intimacy. Is that why ego is so fiercely maintained? Mild anger can be used in a healthy way to offset or even free us from fear. For instance, a child afraid of cats can say, "Bad kitty," and shoo a cat away. This gives the child a sense of agency and effectiveness in his powers of self-defense. As a result, he feels less fearful. Fear thrives on powerlessness. Healthy anger activates power. Then, we only have to remind ourselves of what Aristotle said. Everybody can get angry, that's easy. But getting angry at the right person, with the right intensity, at the right time, for the right reason, and in the right way, that's hard. We fear giving up egotistical entitlement because we imagine we will just be out there and taken advantage of. Our self-defense, our ego mindset, has become our anchor, our refuge, the one thing we have to hold on to. We believe we have nothing more going for us since we can't trust anyone to acknowledge our greatness. To free ourselves, we'll have to face disappointment, even humbling experiences, with no easy outs or escape hatches, such as retaliating against those who hurt or humbled us. This is how we give up the familiar and backfiring weapons of protection ego offers us. Actually, disappointment, disillusion, and humiliation are all grist for the mill of egotism reduction and healthy ego rejuvenation. Some people have made being in control the essence of their identity. For instance, a controlling person receives disturbing news from the doctor about a medical condition over which he has no control. His identity is so inextricably tied to being in control that he falls apart once it's threatened. The loss of control is the equivalent of the loss of himself. Not being in control is then like not being anybody. He destabilizes until he believes he's in the driver's seat. Such identifying of being in control and who we are makes being afraid the essence of who we are. Our practice of letting go of ego and its fears refunds us our wonderfully serene true nature. It is not powerlessness itself that leads to humiliation, but the shock experienced by my pretensions to omnipotence when it comes up against the reality of things. The nature of things is for us the best, the most affectionate, and the most humiliating of masters. It is always around us with its vigilant assistance. Hubert Benoit, The Supreme Doctrine. How attention helps. When we contract and tighten in fear, we activate the reptilian brain's fight, flight, freeze reaction, and thereby lose access to our more sophisticated powers. By neural plasticity, which is available to us throughout our lifespan, we can decondition and recondition these patterns. Our prefrontal cortex, a resource of clarity and common sense, can oversee and calm our amygdala, the organ that controls the primitive reactiveness that brings fear to the forefront. The cortex relates to the amygdala like a wise parent to a frightened child. Two forms of attention can help this happen. Focused attention on our breath instills better impulse control and down-regulates the reactivity of the amygdala. Alternatively, a more diffuse attention, no object to focus on, gives us insight into impermanence, including that of our suffering. This can help with the cognitive down-regulating of fears and contraction. We can practice both styles to access our full powers of alertness and equanimity. Both focused and diffuse attention help us open to ourselves. The more of ourselves that we hide, the more difficult it is to gain access to the prefrontal cortex. Then we lose out on ego's management skills. Likewise, we can't easily have empathy for others when we disown the parts of ourselves that we don't like. That's why it's hard for an ego-driven person to have compassion. Conceit won't allow him to acknowledge the same inadequacy, wound, or difficulty in himself that he sees in others. Only the vulnerable can have sincere compassion. This is why letting go of egotism is ultimately about becoming more loving toward ourselves and others. Mindfulness helps because it offsets the self-centralized focus that fear thrives on. Instead of that fixation, mindful awareness is diffuse. It's a focus that doesn't fixate on an object. Focused attention resides in the ventral medial part of the cortex. This is the part of